Everyone, and welcome to Power Hour. Looks like we're in for another gorgeous day in the Low Country, and I know that if you're like me, you're ready for that. Well, we're gonna get going right away this morning because we're very fortunate. We're gonna have U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham joining us later in the program to share his perspective on what's happening across the globe. However, first though, we're very pleased to welcome our own South Carolina Senator Tom Davis. Around the chamber, we often refer to him as the senator as Get It Done Davis, and it's a nickname he certainly earned. Senator Davis has built a reputation delivering results on the issues that matter most in the Low Country. He's been deeply involved in infrastructure policy, and many of you have followed the long anticipated progress on widening of I-95. This morning, we've asked him to give us an update on that project and to share what other key investments are advancing that will impact commerce, mobility, and growth as we cross the region. Senator Davis, welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. And, we can also usually say where in the world is Tom Davis. So we'll see where you are today, if you're in your car or on the road or at your office. I think Tom we had him on and then he just dropped off. So we'll give it just a minute for Senator Davis to get back on. Meanwhile, while we're doing that, I wanted to mention the Darius Rucker Intercollegiate Tournament that's going on in Long Cove today. This will be the final day. It's one of the finest collegiate women's tournaments in the country. And so if you have a chance to get out to Long Cove and see beautiful Long Cove, walk the course and watch some of these tremendous athletes play, I would certainly encourage you to do that. I think we have Senator Davis back on now, and glad we got the promotion in there for the Darius Rucker tournament. Senator Davis, are you with us? And while we continue to connect that, I also want to give a shout out to the Hilton Head Island Seafood Festival, the volunteers, the board of directors, all the attendees. What a magnificent weekend it was. And that just continues to grow and grow, and wonderful for our area. Certainly a shout out to the Carmines family for all that they've done through the years to make that happen. Senator Davis, if we have you on now, we'll go ahead and connect. Okay. While we're waiting for the senator, there we go. Senator Davis. Hello, Senator. It's good to see you this morning. If we have you on video, we just need some audio, and we'll be rolling. Thank you for sticking with us through some technical difficulties. I could see that the senator was in his car driving, probably.
I'm here now.
Oh, there he is. Great, Senator. Good to see you. Good to hear you. We're delighted to have you. Not surprised you're back in your car on the road on the move.
Yeah, apologize. I had to pull over because we're hands-free here, so I can't do it when I'm driving. So I'm pulled over.
Setting a great example. Well done. So, Senator, go ahead. We'd love for you to give us an update on some of the infrastructure projects that's going on. I always love to hear about the green space efforts that you have done and continue to do, and other things that are going on in South Carolina.
Well, right now I'm trying to figure out how to get Exit 8 unlocked. We're near the finish line on that. You may have read in the paper recently that the State Infrastructure Bank had some questions about how the developer that owns about 4,000 acres adjacent to the proposed Exit 3 interchange, how it was going to pay for its portion of the construction costs. The way the deal is set up is that the State Infrastructure Bank and the DOT are going to pay for the new Exit 3, and then the parkways extending north and south from that exit are going to be paid for largely by the landowner that's benefiting from those parkways. And the landowner obligation in regard to constructing those parkways is about $60 million. And the State Infrastructure Bank wants an assurance that the developer has the ability to pay for those parkways. And what the developer has said is, we'll give you a first mortgage lien on the 4,000 acres that we owned as collateral for our obligation to expend that $60 million to construct those parkways. And what the State Infrastructure Bank has said, Bill, is that we don't want to have a mortgage. We don't want to have the problem of going through a foreclosure action in case you don't perform. We would rather you put up cash or some cash equivalent. And so, what the landowner is doing now is it's going to a commercial lender and it's going to try to get a letter of credit that will be secured by a mortgage. They'll give a mortgage to the commercial bank for the letter of credit for that $60 million obligation. That way, there is a cash equivalent there that can be shown to the SIB and shown to the DOT by saying, here's a letter of credit guaranteeing that we're going to discharge our cash obligation toward construction of those parkways. In the event we don't perform, you then have the ability to call on that letter of credit to pay for it. So we're in the process of working through the mechanics of all that. I'm confident that at the end of the day, we'll get it done. And it's important that we do get it done. Exit 3 is a vital way for people in Beaufort County, Southern Beaufort County, Southern Jasper County, to exit onto I-95 in case of emergency. Exit 5 and Exit 8 that are currently existing are simply overwhelmed. We need an Exit 3 to provide that additional way out. But I'm confident that we can work through the mechanics of this deal. I'm constantly in communication with John White, who is the chairman of the State Infrastructure Bank, Secretary Powell at the DOT, also community leaders, elected officials in Hardeeville and Jasper County. And I'm also working with the principals for the landowners. So it's a complicated deal, Bill, but I think at the end of the day, we'll get it sorted out.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Couple of questions for you. One question we have that's just come in from Jacob, and Jacob's asking to talk a little bit about the environment and what you're doing for green space and to help protect open space.
Yeah, I mean, the primary thing I've done in that regard, Bill, as you know, is I drafted and the General Assembly enacted the green space law about 3 years ago, which allows counties on a referendum basis to go to the voters and ask for a penny sales tax to fund purchases of open space or green space. And Beaufort County was the first county to take advantage of that law that I drafted and the General Assembly passed, and went to the voters and got approval for a 2-year penny sales tax to raise $100 million. And that has already been collected. The $100 million has been collected, about 45% of it from, tourists and visitors to our area. And we're in the process of then finding tracts of land to expend that $100 million. And there's about half of that money has been committed for purchases. The Green Space Committee on which I sit is being very careful to make sure we get maximum value for dollars expended. For instance, we saved several thousand acres in Chelsea Plantation, which would have resulted in several hundred more homes being built and emptying into 278 and 170. So we're continually looking at taking large tracts of land off the boards in terms of development, because right now we're simply overwhelmed in terms of our infrastructure. So that effort continues in regard to green space. We've got about half of the $100 million expended, and we're busy looking at other projects right now to take off the board.
All right, Senator, thank you. Another question coming in from Sheila, and Sheila's asking if you could talk a little bit about data centers and your views on those.
Yeah, data centers, I mean, obviously there are various externalities associated with data centers that we have to regulate at the state level. They use a tremendous amount of power. I mean, so, anytime a data center is going to locate into a jurisdiction of a utility, that utility has to create new power generation because of the enormous energy needs that they have. What you don't want to have happen is for a data center to come into a service area, say like Dominion's, and then Dominion build power generation and then have the cost of that generation amortized or spread across the existing rate base. You don't want to have existing ratepayers paying for the generation that these data centers need. So one of the things that's in the legislation that I've drafted would require data centers to pay for all the new generation required for their operations. And not only for that new generation, but for any upgrades to the grid, to the distribution and transmission systems in order to get the power to that facility. So that's one piece of the legislation that I've drafted and that's now moving in the General Assembly. The others are more environmental in nature. I mean, data centers also require a lot of water to cool their operations, to cool the chips. And historically, they've taken that water out of the ground and from surface water, and that really causes an environmental concern. But what we're seeing is that markets are doing what markets always do. They respond to challenges, and there are now best practices and technologies available whereby you have so-called closed systems in regard to the cooling. So you draw the water out of the ground or from the surface initially, and then the water is in the data center in a closed system, and it cools the chips and then evaporates, and you use that water again. So one of the things that my legislation up here requires is that data centers use these best practices in regard to the use of water. So I think that's also an externality that can be controlled. The third thing would be the vibrations and the noise associated with data centers. But again, best practices now, you can construct data centers in a way that mitigate and completely mitigate those noises and those vibrations, so you're not going to cause a nuisance to nearby residences. And then lastly, you want to make sure that these data centers are located in an appropriate place. I mean, there are obviously certain places that data centers do not belong. For instance, there was a proposal recently that a data center be placed near the Ace Basin in Colleton County. That clearly is an inappropriate location for a data center. So the fourth thing that my legislation does is it requires a siting analysis. The Department of Environmental Services will, take applications in regard to the location of data centers, look at the environment, look at the ecological area, look at what the area can support, and then it will make an appropriate finding as to where that data center can be safely situated. And one of the things, Bill, that people don't realize is there are about 400 brownfield sites throughout South Carolina, former industrial sites that are, no longer being used for industry, oftentimes are contaminated. We're trying to direct data centers into those brownfield areas because that's more appropriate for them to be located in an industrial area, and also to way to clean up these brownfield sites. So, that's a responsible way of going about regulating data centers. What I don't agree with, Bill, is a minority opinion up here that South Carolina ought to institute an absolute ban against data centers and not allow data centers to come at all into South Carolina. I really don't think that's the way to proceed. The next generation of industry across all sectors is going to be using AI technologies. Those AI technologies rely upon data centers. I mean, if we enact the ban and simply say that South Carolina is not going to have any more data centers, we're going to miss out on the next generation of job creation and wealth creation. The better way of handling things, I think, is to recognize, frankly, that there are various externalities associated with data centers that we have to regulate. We have to make sure they pay for their own power. We have to make sure they use these best practices in regard to water to cool the chips. We need to make sure that they are constructed in a way that isn't noisy and don't have vibrations. And we need to have them sited in appropriate places. So I'm trying to thread that needle between being responsible in regard to regulating data centers, but not putting up an absolute moratorium, because I think that would be very short-sighted.
Senator, thank you. And another question coming in from Jordan. And Jordan is asking and saying, we have great seniority in Columbia with our delegation, and how are we maximizing that?
I think in a lot of ways. I mean, right now we're maximizing it by, fully funding the I-95 widening from the Georgia-South Carolina line to Exit 8. That's been all the funding's in place, the largest DOT contract in the state's history. And we've also lined up the money for the second and third legs of that I-95 expansion all the way to Walterboro exits. And thirdly, we're getting more money put into the budget that will accelerate the timeline for those I-95 improvements. So, we've got a great delegation, and we're really working hard to make sure that our highway infrastructure needs are being met. and that when capital projects are considered by the DOT and by the State Infrastructure Bank, that we are, at the table and making sure that our needs are taken care of. And I think we're seeing that by having unprecedented amounts of money coming down to address our infrastructure.
All right, thank you. Mike is asking, uh, Mike is asking about magistrates and the selection of magistrates. If there's anything to talk on that's going through the legislature.
There is, a couple of things, two things I would say in regard to magistrates. I think they ought to be attorneys. Increasingly magistrates are being called upon to adjudicate the disputes, and it's important that you have somebody on the bench that is conversant with the law. And so I think that's one important reform that we can enact. Secondly, I would like to see, quite frankly, I have a lot of control and say, as do other senators, in regard to who the magistrates should be. I'd rather have the governor make those appointments in regard to magistrates and have the Senate, advise the consent and confirm those magistrates. I mean, sort of like the federal judiciary system where the president of the United States, nominates Supreme Court justices and justices for the Court of Appeals and district courts, and then the Senate confirms those appointments. I think that's probably the best model that's out there, and I am supporting a move in that direction.
All right, Senator, thank you. Troy is asking, what is the status of the possible ferry service you talked about on this forum a few months ago?
Right. What I've done is I've drafted a proviso to have a $2 million appropriation to have the DOT look at Beaufort and Jasper counties for a pilot program on how we can have a comprehensive integrated system of waterborne transportation. There's a lot of money that's available. You can pull down from the federal level for waterborne transportation if you have a comprehensive plan in place. But that's a condition precedent. So what I'm working on right now is getting an appropriation in this year's state budget to have that study done for our waterways in Beaufort and Jasper counties, so the DOT can have a pilot program in regard to, where are the embarkation, debarkation points, what kind of vessels, what sort of schedules, how do they run, what should the network look like? I mean, as an example, Bill, people that live in St. Helena, if they want to work on Hilton Head, it takes them an hour and 45 minutes to drive there in the morning. But if there were a ferry system that ran on a regular basis, you could have them get to work in 25, 30 minutes. And so we talk a lot about the workforce problem, particularly in Southern Beaufort County. A waterborne system of transportation would be a way of unlocking a workforce that right now just doesn't want to spend an hour and 45 minutes on the road to get there.
All right. Abby is asking, would those ferries be manufactured here?
And one of the things that I'm working on is there's a company in Stockholm, and I actually flew to Stockholm on my own dime because I thought that was appropriate that I pay for it, but to educate myself as to these hydrofoil boats, these hydrofoil passenger boats that carry up to 40 to 50 passengers. They can go up to 30 knots. They're quiet, silent, they're electric, there's no wake. Which means they can travel much more quickly. I mean, right now, for instance, if you go to Defusky on the ferry, you have to go very slow the first 15, 20 minutes because of the no wake requirements. If you have these hydrofoil boats, you don't have wakes. And so I'm looking at Candela as a boat, or electrical, hydrofoil boats in general, not just Candela, as a means of being the vessels for this transportation system I'm talking about. But they're also Candela is looking to locate their manufacturing operations in the United States. They already are quite extensive in Europe, operating in Sweden and other European countries. But in order to build boats or vessels or sell vessels in the United States, they have to be built in the United States under the Jones Act and the federal government. So they're looking at Jasper County as a potential site for their manufacturing operations, which I think would be fantastic. We're currently, I think, in a competition with Florida in order to get that business, but I think that South Carolina has a lot to offer. I mean, Jasper County's got proximity to port in Savannah. It's got proximity to an airport, proximity to I-95. There is a lot of land in Jasper County that can be developed. I mean, so I think it's an ideal site for Candela, and I hope they decide to locate there.
All right, thank you. And next question is about what your top priorities are before the end of this legislative session.
Well, right now, in the budget, making sure that we get an appropriate amount of money allocated for our roads. I mean, I mean, I want to accelerate those I-95 improvements. I mean, it's great that it's funded and underway from the Georgia line to Exit 8, and it's great that we have funding in place for the remaining legs. But I want more funds put to DOT to accelerate those timelines for I-95. I mean, infrastructure is a critical need. Second to that, I think we need to get our arms wrapped around what I consider to be out of control development. We have a lot of development that's occurring, a lot of housings coming online that our infrastructure simply can't support. And so, some legislation that I have filed and just passed out of committee yesterday, in fact, is called concurrency, which would allow a local government, when a landowner comes or developer comes forward and says, okay, we have a right to build these many homes and we want to go ahead and pay the impact fees associated with that, give us a building permit. The concurrency legislation that I'm drafting would allow the local government to say, we understand that you have these density rights. We understand that you're willing to contribute toward infrastructure, but right now the roads are simply overwhelmed. We can't handle the growth. And so concurrency legislation would allow a local government to have that development phased in or delayed until such time as the infrastructure was actually in place to accommodate the growth or the impacts that new development would have. So it's a fine line between giving local governments the ability to have smart growth and at the same time being fair to a landowner who obviously has capital invested in their land, and you've got to be fair to the landowner too. But giving local governments some more tools, concurrency legislation authority, I think is going to be critical as well.
Thank you. And another question coming from Jason. And Jason is asking, what's the latest regarding the Hilton Head Island bridges?
Well, we're moving forward. I mean, the DOT is moving forward in regard to the new eastbound span, 3 lanes from Moss Creek all the way to Windmill Harbor. Those 3 lanes would run parallel to the existing eastbound lane. So you would have 3 lanes, a brand new 3 lane span eastbound from Moss Creek to Windmill Harbor. And then once that's completed, the existing span eastbound will be taken down. What isn't currently contemplated, and that process is being engineered. Once it's fully engineered, they'll go out to bid and let contracts and begin construction on that sometime, I would imagine, late next year. But the money for that is in place and that's proceeding. 2 other pieces of the puzzle remain. One is what I call the on-island piece from Windmill Harbor to the Cross Island exits. And the town of Hilton Head has done an excellent job of creating a master plan for that on-island piece to have a really nice gateway effect for Hilton Head. And it's my understanding that that on-island piece is going to cost about $50 to $60 million. And so once I have those plans in my hands and share it with the rest of the delegation, we'll begin trying to figure out how do we put the financing pieces in place to pay for those on-island improvements. And ideally, you would want those on-island improvements to occur concurrently with the new 3 lane span eastbound that's coming onto the island. So those are 2 pieces of the puzzle. The third piece, of course, is the westbound span, going off of the island onto the mainland. That's 2 lanes right now. Those lanes or that infrastructure right now is in good condition. I mean, it's not under any threat of structural defects, but we do need to put in place and be looking at how do we go ahead and have the 3 lane span going westbound as well. So we need to work on that in the future, Bill. But for right now, the first 2 pieces are what we're working on. The eastbound 3 lanes from Moss Creek to Windmill Harbor, and then the on-island piece from Windmill Harbor to the Cross Island Parkway.
Senator, you're frequently referred to around the chamber here as Get It Done Davis, and I think our listeners can understand why and seeing you in action. We appreciate your leadership in the state and all you do for us locally here. And thank you for pulling over and taking time to be with us this morning.
It's my pleasure, Bill. I appreciate you letting me share.
Safe travels.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Okay, that was Senator Davis. Now we're moving right along, and it's clearly an important time for us here in the U.S., certainly interest around the world, and we're especially grateful that we have U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, that he could step away from his demanding schedule, and he's with us today on Power Hour. Senator Graham brings decades of experience in foreign policy and international affairs. He's long been deeply engaged on national security matters and maintains a close working relationship with President Trump, which gives him a unique vantage point on how decisions are being made and shaped at the highest levels. Senator, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours, sir.
Well, I wish I were there. If you're thinking about going to Iran, don't. We're at a moment of history making here. I know everybody's wondering what's going to happen. A little bit of background. It got to be clear that the Iranians were never going to give up their ambitions to wreak havoc on the world. They're religious Nazis. They want a nuclear weapon. They would use it for religious purposes. As long as the Ayatollah and his regime's in existence, they're going to undermine stability in the region and come after us. You know, people had a hard time believing that Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews, but he did. I think normal people have a hard time believing they could be religious fanatics like this, but they are. And President Trump came to conclude that if I don't deal with them now, it's just going to get even harder. When we bombed their nuclear facilities in Midnight Hammer, they were right back at it in a few weeks. And I just think President Trump has come to believe that this regime has to be dealt with now. Can you imagine how powerful they would be if they went another year building 100 missiles a week? A month, and just getting stronger and stronger. The money we gave them for the JCPOA was all put into their war machine, not roads, bridges, and hospitals. So I think President Trump had to do what he did. These people will never stop trying to press their religious agenda. They really do want to destroy all the Jews, purify Islam, and come after us. And the sooner you realize that, the better. I've known that for a long time. The military operation is ahead of schedule. It's been amazing to see what our men and women in uniform can do, along with our Israeli partners. 6 have been lost. God bless them. But if you can't accept casualties, you'll never be safe, and Trump's going to see this thing through. And when this regime collapses, it's not if, it's just when. Then we can get back to the table of major peace deals, build on the Abraham Accords, get Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. I've been working on that for years, and I'll go right back at it. That would lead to the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict as we know it. If Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the Holy Mosque, the center of Islam, would recognize the Jewish state, that would change the region unlike anything in 1,000 years. And I think that will happen when the regime collapses. We're not there yet. There are going to be some groups being armed inside the country to kind of confront the regime. We will not get on the ground in any meaningful way. This is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. What happens next is up to the Iranian people. I don't believe they're out in the streets to want more Ayatollah. I think they're out in the streets to have less Ayatollah. If they ever get in charge of the country, I think we'll have a decent chance of having a friend. The Ayatollah and his crowd, there's zero chance they would ever be our friend or give up on their desire to kill us all. The new crowd, whoever that will be, I think it'll be much greater than zero. As to Israel, they've got no choice. This is absolute fight for their existence. And I would just tell everybody on the phone, since 1979, the Iranians have been coming after us. 1983, you had 220 Marines killed, 18 sailors, 3 members of the Army, and a barracks bombing in Beirut. They've got a lot of American blood on their hands. These IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan came from Iran, and they've killed and maimed a lot of Americans. So I am all with President Trump to call the question on Iran in this terrorist state. The mothership of terrorism is sinking, the Iranian regime, and the captain is dead. And let's just see this through. And once this regime collapses, the world will be safer. The Mideast will have opportunities no one's ever dreamed of, and it has to be done. You pay now or you pay later. Domestically, oil prices are going to go up, but they'll come back down. The amount of production in the world market right now is going to keep oil prices on the low side once this war is over. Inflation is trending in the right direction. The One Big Beautiful Bill tax cuts kick in about the rest of this year. So I think you're going to be able to depreciate your new investment at a faster rate. You're going to get lower rates, and this will help, add jobs and grow the economy. But this conflict in Iran, it's been in the making since 1979. For 47 years, they've been nothing but a problem, and I'm hoping and praying soon that will be behind us. So economically, I think by the end of the year, by election time, you're going to have continued economic growth, lowering of inflation, and the benefits of the tax portions of the One Big Beautiful Bill are going to start paying dividends for your businesses. So I can't wait to come home and say hey to everybody and maybe come to the tournament, but just pray for our men and women in uniform. They're doing something really hard but really necessary, and pray for our friends in Israel. If you've got any questions, I'd be glad to answer a few.
Senator, thank you. Thank you very much. And we do have some questions from our listeners. And the first one's coming in from Marcus. And Marcus is asking you, how long do you foresee this war going on?
I think, we got, and the operations are taking a turn today and tomorrow. They're going to be much more aggressive. We decapitated the senior leadership. We're going to level 2. We're going to continue to go after the security infrastructure that torments and oppresses the people. But, I think weeks, I think a couple more weeks at this rate, we'll be in really good shape. And what happens next is up to the Iranian people. I don't believe it's, because you break it, you own it, and may be true for a consignment shop, but not for foreign policy. The reason we did this is the threat level against us was just way too high. They were building missiles that could reach America. The proxies have got a lot of American blood on their hands. Hamas has blood of the Houthis. And, they're largest state sponsor of terrorism. They nuclear weapon capable desire, and we just had to deal with that. And if you waited another year where they get more missiles and more conventional capability, it would have been hard to take on their nuclear program. I think the Arabs are going to get involved in the next day or two, and hopefully by the end of this week, you'll have a coalition of the regional Arab partners and the United States, and Europe's going to get more involved, and it's going to be overwhelming. There's operations in Lebanon now. Hezbollah's acted up, but I'm so appreciative of our military. We're ahead of schedule, and it's not when it ends, it's how it ends. I look at it that way. It's not the date that it ends, it's how did it end. Afghanistan ended badly, right? And we want to make sure this ends well.
Thank you, Senator. Another question is coming in from Beth, and Beth is asking, how does this impact oil for Russia and China?
It will help them in the short term. It'll be a spike in prices. But Russia's biggest nightmare is that the regime collapsed because they provided Russia all these drones. Iran's been a very big weapons supplier to the Russians. A lot of these drones that are so effective are made in Iran. And at the end of the day, if you can take the regime down, that's just one less bad actor to fuel the war in Ukraine and Russia. So a net loss to the Russians and the Chinese, quite frankly. The oil that is in Iran will be aligned with us. I think one of the first things you see a new government do is to come to us to help develop their oil fields, not the Chinese. We could actually be one of the economic benefits of this war is increased production in Iran that helps America.
We know your schedule's busy. We do have 2 more questions that have come in, and time for those, and then we'll let you run on to your next meeting. All right, thank you. Beth is asking if you would speculate on who you might speculate would fill the Iranian leadership gap.
I think the people are in the process. There are different groups forming. It's not as tribal as other Mideastern countries, so it won't be as complicated. you got the former crown prince, the oldest son of the Shah. He's out trying to work a transition plan. But, you know, I told the president, listen, we're breaking the threats to America. They will no longer, after this is over, be able to hit our homeland. They're going to be out of the nuclear business, and their support for terrorist groups is going to be way down, and that makes us safer. As to what happens next, kind of let the Iranian people figure that out. When we get involved and start doing everything, people just don't take ownership of their own lives. And I don't want that to happen again in Iraq and Afghanistan. We got so involved that people on the ground just kind of deferred to us. I told the president, give the people a chance. And here's what I would say. There's zero chance the Ayatollah would ever be our friend. The people coming, I think it goes well beyond zero. And look at it this way. Do you think these people are getting killed out in the streets to want more Ayatollah? I don't. So I'm optimistic that when the regime collapses, it'll be messy, but over time we'll have somebody we can do business with better than the Ayatollah.
All right, sir. Last question we have, or at least the last one we have time for, is Chelsea is asking if the timing of the Iran attack had any correlation with U.S. influence over Venezuelan oil.
No. It had to do with their effort to reconstitute their nuclear program. Once we did Midnight Hammer, you know, we really obliterated it, but they were right back at it. And they increased missile production. So instead of kind of standing down and trying to find a diplomatic solution, they were talking about, you know, a peaceful solution, and their activity was to build up their missile and nuclear capability. And that's what made Trump act, is that they were going to, they had not changed their desire to wreak havoc on the region. And, you know, Venezuela was one of the most amazing military operations I've ever seen. To go into the heart of a country on a major military base and snatch the leader in like 5 minutes is just hard to absorb. But what's going on in Iran is just a very incredibly aggressive air campaign to destroy the regime's capability to project power and hurt us in the future. And I think there'll come a day here when the regime's security apparatus is so weak that when people rise up, they'll have a chance to take over. Right now, they're not there, but that's coming. So Venezuela was the mothership of drugs coming into America, cocaine particularly, and narco-terrorist state. Everybody wanted Maduro out. He was an indicted guy in New York. Every Republican, every Democrat talked about how bad he was, and Trump just did something about it. These drug cartels were poisoning in America, killing more Americans than any other form of terrorism. And they're on the run now. President Trump has put Venezuela out of the drug business. Cuba will fall here soon. And it's going to be an amazing transformation in our backyard. That not only have we secured our border, but we're shutting down the supply of drugs, cocaine and fentanyl, coming from our backyard. And that will make us safer. And a lot of people on this phone probably know somebody who's had a fentanyl or drug problem, and be nice to deal with the drug traffickers in our backyard. So Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, if he can pull this off, it'd be the most historic thing since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I've been with him at every step. I've spent a lot of time with him. I just got back from the region 2 weeks ago, making sure everybody's ready to go. You know, you need partners when you start these things, and I'm hoping the Arabs will jump in here in the next day or two. And we got a chance we've never had since 1979. The Iranian economy is in shambles. He's put tariffs on anybody who buys Iranian oil. The military has really been hurt from all these operations by the United States and Israel, and the people are basically ready to topple the regime. Those three things have never happened together since 1979, and this is the moment. Pray that we get it right, and I feel very good about it. And back here at home, I think you're going to have a growing economy, and the cutting regulations, keeping taxes low, it's all going to pay dividends here, and hopefully we'll have energy costs go down after the war. But the chamber, y'all are the heart and soul of the community down there. You're competitors in the business space, but you work together to make the community special, and that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm trying to work with Democrats to help build on the Abraham Accords when Iran collapses. So pray for our folks in harm's way, and I will see you soon, and I'll try to get my golf clubs out.
Senator, thank you very, very much for your time today. Very kind of you. And we hope to see you at the RBC Heritage very, very soon.
All right. Be safe, guys. Thanks.
Thank you. United States Senator Graham. He talked a little bit about the economy, and appropriately, we're going to turn now to research economist Dr. Joy Von Essen with Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Van Essen consistently helps us translate what's happening globally, statewide, into what it means here locally. With instability overseas and financial markets reacting in real time, we're especially interested in how global events could ripple through South Carolina's economy. Dr. Van Essen, welcome back. We're glad you're with us this morning, and we're very, very excited to hear your take on what's going on.
Well, good morning, Bill, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And I know we have a lot on the agenda, so we'll just jump right in, taking a look at South Carolina's economic outlook for 2026, where we are and where we are likely headed in the coming months. And really, when we're trying to get our arms around where South Carolina's economy is, we can start with the dominant theme that has emerged over the last 12 to 18 months, this theme of pervasive economic uncertainty that has been with us for a period of time and has extended into 2026. I think all of us resonate with that theme of uncertainty to a certain extent. And it's come about from multiple forms, two primary ways that we see this. One is business uncertainty, and the other is consumer uncertainty. And on the business side, uncertainty has emerged over the last year because of the back and forth on trade policy and new tariffs that have been implemented. And of course, those tariff discussions have moved into 2026 as well. And one of the practical implications of that is that we have seen businesses in some cases go into wait and see mode, meaning that even though we're continuing to see stable demand overall and business production has remained relatively stable, businesses have been less likely to invest and hire and make major decisions about looking towards the future, simply because they are more uncertain about where prices are headed, what supply chains are going to look like, what the market environment is going to be. So we have seen business uncertainty lead to that wait and see mode across many sectors. And then secondly, consumer uncertainty is also relatively high, and that's coming from affordability concerns and rising prices and some of the lingering effects of inflation that we've seen over the last several years. And I want to take just a quick moment to talk a little bit more about consumer uncertainty, because consumers, remember, drive the bulk of our economy. About 70% of our economy comes from consumer spending, 70% of GDP. So it's important to understand what consumers are thinking, what they are doing, and what motivates them to either increase or decrease their levels of spending activity. And the bottom line is that when we look at consumer activity and what they care about, it comes down to three things: job security, wages, and prices. Certainly nothing that would surprise any of us. The three things that are of most pressing concern: will you have a job next year? Are you going to get a raise at work? And what are prices doing around you? Are price changes making things more or less affordable? And so we can really measure these three factors by looking at trends in what we call real wage growth. And real wage growth is just looking at the difference over time between the growth in wages that we see and the growth in prices. And ideally, what we would like to see is a situation where wages are consistently growing faster than prices. Because as you can see here, if you get, for example, a 3% raise at work, but everything around you goes up by 3% in terms of how much it costs at the store, then you're not actually any better off, right? And you could be worse off if your wages go up by 3% and prices rise by, say, 5%. So we have to look at that difference between the growth in wages and the growth in prices, or what we call real wage growth. And so if we track that over time, you can actually see what real wage growth has been doing going all the way back to May of 2020, right in the midst of or at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see a major decline in real wage growth up through 2022 when inflation peaked and we saw prices rising faster than wages. But since 2022, we've begun to see consumers really claw back that lost purchasing power because wages are now growing faster than prices again. But having said that, we have not yet gotten back to that level that we were at in May of 2020. So in other words, when we look overall over the last 5 years or so, consumers are still worse off from a purchasing power perspective than they were in May of 2020. We haven't clawed back all that lost purchasing power, but we're moving in the right direction and we're on track to get there basically about a year from now, about the summer of 2027. So you can see the rapid decline in real wage growth, the rapid loss in purchasing power, and the fact that we're recovering it, but it's just taking quite a bit of time, which is what we would expect. There's certainly nothing unusual about that. But the net result is that consumers continue to be cranky, is the term that I use. And I think it's an accurate description because if we look at consumer sentiment, it remains at historic lows. You can see that's extended into 2026, where we've circled on the right-hand side of the screen there. But it's not just about what's been happening in recent months. Notice that consumer sentiment has been consistently below pre-pandemic norms over the last 5 years or so. And that is largely due to the fact that consumers have lost purchasing power. And even though they are recovering it, we're seeing a steady movement in a positive direction because on average, consumers are still worse off from a purchasing power perspective than they were in 2020. Consumer sentiment overall remains fairly low. But we also have to ask the question as to whether this is actually impacting the economy. How has uncertainty actually affected economic growth? Has it had a meaningful impact or not? And the bottom line is that growth has decelerated over the last year. We've seen some impacts from uncertainty, but only marginally. And that's very important. A deceleration of growth, but only marginally. So overall, the economy remains stable and in fairly good shape. And we can see this deceleration very clearly. To give you some perspective on the degree to which we've seen a pullback in economic activity, just looking at GDP growth over the last several years and comparing that to what we saw in 2025. And you can see a pullback from about 2.8% to 2.2%. So roughly a half percentage point or so in terms of the change in overall economic activity in the last year because of a lot of this uncertainty. So it's had an effect. It hasn't had zero effect, but we are still seeing stable growth overall at the US level and in South Carolina. We can also see this change from a labor market perspective. And one of the other factors that we have seen, and one of the new economic trends that we've seen emerge in the labor market, is what we call a low hire, low fire economy. Again, another term that I think is very accurate to describe where we are, meaning that we're seeing a slowdown in hiring because many companies, being in that wait and see mode, are not looking to necessarily expand or invest in hire as much because the outlook is a bit cloudier because of the back and forth on trade policy. But they're also still seeing steady demand. So we're not seeing any type of uptick in layoff activity, so a low fire environment. And we can see that again very clearly in the data. And we can look at growth at the US level and in South Carolina, just to give you some perspective on how South Carolina is doing far better than what we're seeing at the national level. So if you look at total employment growth over the last year, South Carolina about 1.3% compared to 0.2% for the US. But notice that even though South Carolina is doing better, both at the state and the national level, most of the growth has been coming from the services sector, not so much from the goods sectors. And the reason is because the goods sectors are those that have been more impacted by the uncertainty associated with international trade and price increases due to tariffs. So think about manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, logistics, retail trade. Those are the sectors that have seen a bit of a pullback over the last year. Meanwhile, the service sectors have continued to be very strong and have become the primary drivers of growth in the last 12 months or so. We also see the low layoff activity very clearly in the data. Again, a low fire economy. So this gives you a sense of what initial unemployment insurance claims have looked like. And initial unemployment insurance claims are the way that we track the number of newly laid off workers in South Carolina. So when someone is laid off from their job, they have the opportunity to file for unemployment insurance benefits. And when they do that for the first time, they are considered an initial UI claimant, and so we can just track the number of people who are filing. And so this gives you a sense here of the number of people filing over time in South Carolina in 2025 on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can just compare what 2025 looked like compared to 2017 and compared to 2001, the last 2 years where we had an unemployment rate in South Carolina of between 4 and 5%. And again, the trends are very clear here. In 2001, when we went into a recession following the bust of the dot-com bubble, that was a very different environment than what we faced in 2017, where we had a very healthy labor market. And clearly you can see here that 2025 looks a lot more like 2017 than it does 2001. So a low hire, low fire economy that is very clearly observed when we look at the data. So just briefly then, looking ahead, and then we'll go in and be happy to talk through any questions that you have, but want to talk a little bit about what our expectations are for 2026 as we move forward. Well, first of all, if we look at the major drivers of demand, both employment and population growth, those are the primary drivers in any local region. And in South Carolina, both of those drivers are stable and remain strong as we move into the spring months. So I give that a smiley face there for both metrics. So that's good news. We've seen employment growth already, again, a tapering over the last year. So a bit of a slowdown, but as we've seen, South Carolina is doing far better than what we're seeing at the national level in terms of overall growth rates. And our population demand continues to be very strong. You may have seen recently that the U.S. Census Bureau just released the latest data for 2025, which you can see here. South Carolina ranks #1 in the country in terms of our population growth rate. And we have been consistently in the top 5 going all the way back to 2020. So South Carolina continues to do well. And every projection in terms of population trends for the U.S. clearly shows that over the next several decades, the southeastern United States is going to see more population gains than any other region of the country. So again, from a purely demand perspective, that's very good news for South Carolina. We'll continue to see population growth, and our steady employment growth means that demand is likely to be fairly steady going forward. And so if we look at most measures, the U.S. consumer and U.S. business activity do remain stable in 2026, but there isn't much wiggle room for further cooling. That's the key takeaway. We don't really have a lot of extra wiggle room to absorb a major economic shock, because as we've talked about, we've already seen a bit of a pullback in activity, and the labor market, while stable, we still see very slow in employment growth. So stability in terms of where we are now, but not a whole lot of wiggle room for further cooling. And so as we wrap up, I want to make a brief comment about the Fed and just talk a little bit about interest rate policy in terms of what this means for 2026, given that we've seen a slower labor market and given that we don't have a whole lot of wiggle room for further cooling. So remember that the Fed has a dual mandate. They are looking both to maximize employment and to minimize inflation, right? They're trying to juggle both of those goals simultaneously. And what you see here is the basic picture that the Fed sees when they're looking at the employment situation. This looks at monthly job gains. In this case, we're looking back to 2023. And the black lines there represent really what we would call the Goldilocks economy, where we want to be. At a national level, we want to ideally be creating between about 100,000 and 200,000 jobs per month. And that's the sweet spot. And so you can just take a look here and just scan this graph and ask yourself, where do you see any major white space between those two black lines. Where's that job growth very weak? And if you do that, the answer I would say is fairly obvious. You see, we can delineate those here, two major white spaces, one in 2024 during the summer and a longer stretch in 2025. And not surprisingly, those are the two periods recently where we've seen the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates. And so, because we've seen a steady period of slower job gains over the last year, that suggests that we will likely see additional cuts from the Fed in 2026 as we look ahead. But that also has to be balanced against the US inflation rate, which, as you can see, has come down significantly over the last several years, but in the last 12 months has remained fairly stable, fairly sticky. So inflation remains above its 2.0% target. It's currently at 2.4%. And we do have some inflationary pressures as we move into the spring. The potential for new tariffs. Again, a lot of uncertainty still on that front. And then, as Senator Graham talked about, oil and gas prices, which have been elevated over the last week or so because of the conflict in Iran. Hopefully that will be short-lived. The good news there in terms of oil and gas prices is that even if oil prices rise, they can come down just as quickly. So it's not like if we see an increase in oil prices, that is necessarily going to be a permanent change. So those prices can fluctuate. So if they go up, they can come back down fairly easily. We have seen a mild increase over the last week or so in oil prices. We can talk more about that if you have questions. But the bottom line is, because there are some inflationary pressures that could potentially push inflation back up towards 3% as we move into the summer, that's going to make the Fed more cautious. So I think that any forecast on what the Fed is going to do we have to take that with a grain of salt, because inflation still very much up in the air in terms of where that's likely to go in the coming months. Again, because we still have upward pressure on inflation coming from these different factors as we move into the spring months. So wrapping up, what is the bottom line? Even though we have seen a mild slowdown over the last year, South Carolina's economy remains healthy overall. Most industries continuing to experience positive gains, but the bulk of the growth really is coming from the services sector, a much more bifurcated economy as a result of new trade policies and new tariffs that have been implemented over the last year. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, South Carolina continues to do very well compared to the national average. Our secret sauce has been our population growth that is currently ranked #1 in the country, and that's likely to continue going forward. And we do have a stable labor market right now in the spring months of 2026, but job growth has slowed, so we are likely to see additional rate cuts this year if inflation doesn't rebound. Right? If inflation doesn't start ticking back up towards 3%, that's the key. So we still have to keep an eye on inflation, and especially now how oil and gas prices, to the extent that they change, may influence inflation in the coming months. So something to keep an eye on. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Bill, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Dr. Van Essen, thank you so much. Great information, and we're always very appreciative of it. And we do have several questions for you. The first one is coming in from Carrie, and Carrie is asking, if global tensions persist, what would South Carolina likely feel the impact first, and how should businesses be preparing for that?
So great question. So I think certainly in the short run, the largest potential effect is going to be what happens with inflation as a result of gas prices, oil and gas prices going up. And so it's helpful to put some numbers on it for perspective. So if you look at oil prices, basically what we see historically is every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil typically leads to an increase in inflation of about 0.2 percentage points, not 2%, 0.2%. Every $10 increase in a barrel of oil. Now, what are oil prices doing? Well, last week at this time, they were about $65 a barrel. They've gone up about 7% or so they're a little over $70 a barrel now. So maybe that gets us to 0.2% in terms of an increase in inflation. So not not insignificant, but also not a major overall shift. And again, to further put that in perspective, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict that started back in 2022, high volatility in oil and gas prices that year. Oil went from about $65 a barrel in 2022 to just over $100 a barrel. It then came back down fairly rapidly, but that level of increase up to about $100 a barrel generates roughly a half percentage point increase in inflation and between 50 to 75 cents a gallon at the pump. So from an inflation perspective, then that takes us from about 2.4% inflation where we are now, could take us up closer to 3%. Again, what is the likelihood of that happening? It depends on the extent of the conflict, how long it lasts, but that's really what we have to look at, because if you see oil and gas prices rise, that filters through, impacts transportation across the board. We don't necessarily anticipate that happening in terms of a major increase. Again, we've seen a slight uptick over the last week or so, but oil prices are very volatile, and in a sense that's a good thing right now, because it means they can come down just as quickly as they've gone up. But after the initial increase over the last week, they've stabilized. So we just have to keep our eye on it. But that's really, from an economic perspective, the biggest wild card right now.
All right, thank you. How do you see, this is from Nicholas, and Nicholas is asking, how do you see what's happening impacting the tourism sector?
So tourism continues to be a major driver, of course, of South Carolina's economy, and we continue to see growth in that has been fairly steady. And as we look to the summer months, the service sector is doing well overall. So we are cautiously optimistic as we move into the summer months that we'll see basically steady growth overall for tourism this year. Again, the uncertainty is still there, but as we continue to see consumers recovering that purchasing power, we are seeing consumer spending that is held up fairly well. So we are cautiously optimistic about tourism going into the summer months.
All right, Dr. Van Essen, we have another question, and it's coming from Lexi. And Lexi's asking about there being talk of eliminating the state income tax. And do you anticipate that happening?
That's a great question. I unfortunately don't have any insight on that in terms of the likelihood that that will actually happen. We'll see. But the big question is, if that is eliminated, what is going to replace it? Is that going to be property tax? Is it going to be sales tax? Is it going to be some combination of that? And what will how will that tax burden shift? And I would say that's the big question to focus on when looking at these discussions surrounding eliminating the income tax is what is that funding, and where does that tax burden shift to? And those are the questions to be asking. But unfortunately, from a political perspective, what is the likelihood of that happening, and how will that shift? We really don't have any specific insight into that, and I think that's still being debated. We're still in the early stages of it.
Dr. Van Essen, always so great to have you with us, and we appreciate your time and explaining it so we can understand it. You're the best, and we look forward to having you back on again in the near future.
Well, it's always my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bill. Hope everyone has a good day.
You too. Thank you, Dr. Joey Van Essen. Well, we're going to close on a note regarding St. Patrick's Day, and we're happy to have Jim LaFierre with us. He's going to talk about really one of Hilton Head Island's most beloved traditions, and that's our St. Patrick's Day Parade. I believe it's the oldest parade in South Carolina, and this year, if I remember correctly, will be the 40th anniversary of the parade. So certainly lots of excitement, and I know that there's going to be plenty of green on Pope Avenue and around the island. So Jim, welcome, and tell us what's in store for this year's parade. All right, so we're switching over here with Jim, and hopefully we'll get Jim going here, and then we'll have a chance to talk about a couple of other things while we're doing that. Certainly want to mention our conversation and cocktails, which is coming up here on March 19th at Tanger One. So mark your calendars for that. And then our Young Professionals program is really taken off, and that group will be meeting on March the 25th, 5:30 at Shelter Cove. So a couple of big events, and I just would be remiss if I didn't mention our Jobs Now 2026 Expo from 9 to 4 on March the 26th at the Culinary Institute of the South. So that some of the events that we have. Our next Power Hour is going to be on April the 1st. So you'll want to mark your calendar April the 1st. And then the RBC Heritage is right around the corner. And our Plaid Party will be on April the 2nd in Sea Pines. Plaid Party is always a big party. So, all right, I see if we have Jim with us now and talk a little bit about the wonderful St. Patrick's Day parade here on Hilton Head Island. And I believe the parade was the first in South Carolina, as well as continues to be the oldest. And Jim's going to start his video, and then we'll be ready to go here. Appreciate you sticking with us while we do that. It's always a lot of connectivity, and well worth it with the great speakers that we have. And so that's most appreciative. We're most appreciative of them coming on. Well, at this time, I don't think we're going to be able to get connected with Jim. So I think we're going to have to say that's a wrap. And sorry we won't get to hear from him, but you can look forward to the parade, and I know you are. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. And Power Hour is about you. Continue to let us know topics of conversation you'd like to have, and we'll do our best to find the appropriate person to address that. Thank you for your support. Have a great day, and we'll see you real soon. Thanks.